Alright, so today is going to be a different kind of Dear Authors video. I'm going to go through the Dear Authors playlist and take each of the subjects that we talked about in a Dear Authors video, and I'm going to give you book recommendations based on the topic. Don't worry, I'm still going to have normal Dear Authors videos out. I just thought this would be a good way to give some recommendations based off of stuff that we've already talked about. This list was surprisingly hard to make, and I think from here on out I'm gonna try to do better about giving very specific examples of books that do things really well at the end of each Dear Authors video for however long that series goes on. But for right now, I just wanted to curate a list based on that stuff. I figure pretty much anybody could get recommendations based off this, and I tried to make it as broad as I could in genres, because I read a lot of genres. I just talk about a lot of fantasy, and I tried to bring some of that. I don't know how well I did, actually. Anyway, I'm skipping over the Dear Authors Please Stop, Dear Authors What Readers Want, because that's not really helpful for this subject, and we're talking about specific topics that we talked about. And the first video that I made that was topic specific in the Dear Authors category was endings, great and terrible endings. I guess I should also mention real quick, I'm not going to go deep into why these books did these things great or what is great and bad about certain topics, because we have videos dedicated to them. The Dear Authors playlist will be linked in the description. This is just going to be books that did well. So for endings, we're going to start out with the First Law trilogy. The reason I went with the First Law is because one of the most satisfying things about a series ender or a book ender is when there have been threads all throughout the story that all feel like they fit well in the story, but when the ending happens, they all come together, and you can tell that the author was intentional from the very start about where we would be in the end. And it could be clues for a big mystery, or it could be some big reveal or twist that all makes sense because the ground was laid early on, or it could just be these things that we don't even notice until we get to the end and we say, oh, this has all been leading up to this. It's so satisfying as a reader to get to the end and realize how intentional the author was from the beginning. And I think that the First Law trilogy does a great job at that. Another author that does that incredibly well in all of his books is Frederick Bachman, my favorite author of all time. I could hold up any of his books here. I'm holding up my favorite of his, but Frederick Bachman writes in a way that is so incredibly intentional, and he, all throughout his books, hits me with these incredible things. I mean, I could make a video on writing and talk a lot about Bachman as well as other authors. But he also, at the end of his books, I can just see how much intentionality he put in from the beginning to the end. His endings also really hit me hard. This book in particular was my first Bachman book, and I listened to it on audiobook, and I had to listen to the ending 3 times. I kept having to rewind the audiobook and listen to it again because I was crying so loudly that I couldn't hear the ending of the book, which I don't know if that's a good seller, but it is for me. Not all of his books caused that big of a reaction for me, but his books just are so powerful and I love them so much. And his endings. We're talking about endings. His endings are great. Next topic-specific video that I made, I don't even know if I'm doing these in the right order, was villains. And man, this is a terrible one for me to do because villains are characters that I tend to not connect with or even care about a lot of the time. It was a great topic to discuss, and I think that we had some great discussion in that video, but as far as coming up with examples of great villains, I just don't tend to notice villains or care about villains as much as some other people do. So my list for this is terrible because my favorite villains are not going to be helpful for this topic. My favorite villains are when we're actually following the villain. They're the protagonist, or at the very least, we're following someone that's very morally gray and that maybe doesn't end in the most moral place. So those are the examples I'm giving you because I genuinely could not think of a hero story where the antagonist is one that am afraid of. So, morally gray or just downright bad main characters. One of the best is in Death Note. Light, he tried. He tried to be a good guy, but the power, it went to his head, and I love it. Death Note is about a notebook that Light, the main character, acquires and is able to write names down in and cause them to die. And initially, he attempts to do it, you know, morally, trying to get rid of the bad guys, but, you know, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Some other great ones are The Picture of Dorian Gray, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, back to the first Law trilogy, and the first person that I came up with this list, and probably my favorite on the list, The Count of Monte Cristo. Oh, and pretty much any domestic thriller ever. Next topic was subversion of tropes. This is a hard one because it's kind of difficult to say that tropes are subverted without getting into some spoilers, so I'll just give a couple of examples here. While The Wheel of Time doesn't subvert all the tropes it plays with, the miscommunication trope is present throughout the entire 14-book series, and that is not subverted. The Chosen One trope, which is the main trope that the series works with, is subverted so satisfyingly. And the other one that I wanted to talk about is North and South. This is a classic romance, and classic romances tend to end a certain way. And this is not a tragedy, okay? So it's not, don't get me wrong, it's still romance, but it tends to end a certain way. It tends to have a certain relationship dynamic in the end. And North and South really surprised me with how it subverted that and how the relationship dynamic in the end was really cool. It was really cool what this author did. I was so impressed with it. There's a ton of great books that I could talk about for subverting tropes, but I really have a hard time doing that one without spoilers. I did a video about main characters, so let me tell you about some of my favorite main characters. You may be surprised to hear this, but Locke and Jean would be on this list for me. Hilarious idiots that are incredibly smart despite being idiots. The best friendships I've ever read. Deep, brilliant. You can't convince me out of my love for that series. This was in my last video, but Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, these two guys are on my list for sure now. Like I said in the last video, if you love the classic Sherlock series, you will love Norrell, because he is very Sherlock-esque. Not in the way he's not a detective, but just in his mannerisms, in his quirks, in the ways that make him frustratingly wonderful. Norrell. Also, Strange is wonderful as well. They're very, 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 very flawed characters with a very flawed relationship, but I loved them, and I want to know them in real life. Spensa from Skyward. Funny story. Daniel Green did an interview with Brandon Sanderson, and Sanderson said in that interview that he really struggled with Spensa because as a 40-something-year-old man writing a 16-year-old girl, he was really worried that he was gonna write her poorly. And so he made sure to have quite a few readers in the early stages of this book that fit this demographic so that he could make sure that he wasn't doing a bad job writing her. And when I heard Sanderson say that, it made me laugh because this is the first book that I've ever read that I've actually thought, wow, that's who I was as a 16-year-old girl. And of course, everybody has different experiences. Everybody's gonna see themselves differently in different characters. But if you wanna know, well, probably not 16, probably if you wanna know 14-year-old Merphy who was hurt and dealing with stuff and handling it through a lot of projection and walls, if you wanna know young Merphy, just meet Spensa. I've grown a lot, and I hope to see Spensa grow a lot as well, but if you want to see me at a really vulnerable state, trying to throw up a whole lot of walls, here I am. And I love Spensa for that. I love her for that so much. Beginnings. This one was actually kind of hard for me because I tend to forget how a book starts after I've gotten to the end. But there are a couple that I remember very distinctly had phenomenal beginnings that instantly had me hooked. Rage of Dragons did a great job, an amazing job at introducing me to an environment, a world, and a magic system very, very quickly without info dumps. It's so hard to do that, and this book did it so well in a scene that was incredibly engaging, that instantly had me attached to characters, instantly had me attached to the world, and gave me a really unique world and a really unique magic system that I'm not used to reading, and did it all in a short period of time without info dumps by displaying it all on page. Oh my goodness, so hard to do, so well done. And then it did one of those things that I hate in beginnings, which is giving me a prologue where I instantly attach myself to characters and a situation and a time, and then jump really far into the future and make my main character someone else. I hate that, and I was really mad when that happened. But then I instantly became attached to the characters that I was following in the real storyline, in the storyline that I'm actually following, and I wasn't irritated. Which is a pretty big deal. Usually if you play with a trope I hate, I'm gonna be irritated. I'm kinda stubborn that way. Rage of Dragons, man, it's just such a good book. Little Secrets is a thriller, a domestic thriller, with a phenomenal beginning. I will say it begins with a child abduction, so if that sounds like something that you would never want to read, do not read this book, because that's pretty much the entire focus of the book. But the way it's written was very emotional and terrifying and so realistic, and made me want to snuggle my kid. And that's not a spoiler because it happens in the very first chapter. It's in the description of the book, but it was written so well, not just because it was a scary scene, but the way it was written, the tension really hit me hard. And also a book that I have in the other room, Children of Time. I just finished this sci-fi novel, and the beginning was incredible to me. It set up something that doesn't get payoff until later. It instantly had me extremely interested in what in the world I'm getting into, and it set me up to get that the tone of this book is going to be intense, but also weird. And I loved that. Magic. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. We did a video on magic systems. I did a video before we did our Dear Authors magic systems. I did a video on my favorite magic systems. We'll link it up there and in the description. I don't really need to talk about this a lot because I've done a video talking about my favorite magic systems. So just briefly, some of my favorites are Mistborn, Wheel of Time, The Name of the Wind, Death Note again. There's one more on that list in that video. Just go watch the video. I go into why I love these magic systems, more information about them. I don't want to be too repetitive here. Redemption! We did a whole video about redemption arcs before I had finished watching Avatar. It was still a good discussion. I still enjoyed the video. I'm proud of the video. I like the video. The best redemption arc is in Avatar: The Last Airbender. If you haven't watched it yet, I am judging you, and you should do it. Moving on. No, I don't have a book recommendation. Just Avatar. Just watch Avatar. Romance. This is another one that I'm just going to kind of skip over because I'm just not the person to talk about romance. This is probably the Dear Authors video that I think I did the worst at. Even though I do think that I had some things to contribute, I really didn't have that much to talk about because romance just is not my genre. It's not something that I latch on to easily. I don't know what's wrong with me. It's just the way it is. And I don't have a lot to talk about here. So I will say, here's a contemporary book that I loved as a teenager and have not stopped loving. Still regularly reread. Always love it. On the Fence by Casey West. There's a glare. There it is. All these books are in the description. But really, I'm just not the person to talk with you about romance. Sequels! I'm gonna go the easy route here and just talk about some of my favorite series. Great sequels. I love Sanderson's middle books. Words of Radiance, which I guess isn't technically a middle book because it's gonna be 5 books within a 10-book series. Anyway, Words of Radiance, Well of Ascension. A lot of people don't like Well of Ascension that much, but it's my favorite of the trilogy. Red Seas Under Red Skies was a phenomenal sequel. Again, there's mixed opinions out there. It was phenomenal. Most of the series that I read are fantasy. And friendships. I'm gonna surprise you with this one. Are you ready? The Lies of Locke Lamora, Locke and Jean, are my favorite friendship of all time. The level of loyalty, especially that one scene in book 2, Red Seas Under Red Skies, one of the best scenes in all of literature, in my opinion. The best friendship I've ever read, unyielding loyalty and deep love for each other, as well as not being afraid to smack each other upside the head and say, you're better than this. Again, thinking about book 2. I can't hype it enough. The Lord of the Rings, obviously Samwise and Frodo, as well as Legolas and Gimli, which I get a lot of pushback on, but I don't care what anybody says. I love that friendship. I'm gonna surprise you on my next 2 friendships I'm listing. Little Women, which I know they're family, they're sisters, but I stand by it. The level of love and intimacy within these women is phenomenal. And I really want to reread Little Women and read the whole series because deep, true friendships, die hard, you're my life, you're an incredibly important part of my life, it's just my favorite. It's my favorite thing to read about. And most friendships that are written incredibly well are written between men, which is great. I love to read it, but I just don't have that many friendships between women that are this strong, that I love this much. So I'm gonna read this again because it makes me happy. It just makes me happy. And last one that I'm gonna show you are Calvin and Hobbes because they deserve to be here. Calvin and Hobbes is one of my favorite series of all time. I have tried to read it to my son multiple times and he's just too young to get it. He appreciates how much I laugh, but he's not there yet. But it captures the imagination of a child so perfectly. Calvin is the wittiest little brat and I love him so much. And his relationship with Hobbes is just beautiful. So that is my long list of books that I think fit well into some of the topics that we've discussed. I would love to continue chatting about some of these books in the comments with you guys, but I would also really, really love if you guys made your own list. What are some recommendations that you would make for each of these tropes or just some of your favorite topics? I said tropes, topics, or just some of your favorite topics in the Dear Author series that we've discussed so far. I post videos every Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. I'll see you guys again soon. Bye.